Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Streaming Alchemy. I'm John Mahoney, and on today's show, we're going to be taking a look at a auto-tracking PTZ camera called the SimplTrack Lite by Huddlecam. We've gotten to spend some time with it over the past few weeks, and we wanted to sort of give you our experience with it, dig a little deeper into, the specs on it, how you configure it, and how it actually looks in an actual production, especially around the tracking. So we'll do a live demo of the tracking at the end of the show. So before we dive into the detail here, I welcome everybody, please, if you'd like to share anything with us, have any questions, any comments, please just post them in the comments below across whatever platform you're viewing from, and we'll get to them live on air here. Also, if you'd like to join us live on the show, we have a video call-in. So if you just go to the URL here, it's also posted in the show notes. Somebody from the studio will get you on air with us. So let's get started. So about 3 weeks ago, we received the camera to test from the folks at Huddlecam, PTZ Optics, that they wanted to get some of our feedback on and see, what we thought of it. And it was the SimplTrack Lite, which is really a fairly small footprint camera produced by Huddlecam that, in addition to a lot of other great capabilities that are sort of baked into this, it does auto tracking and sells for under $1,500, sort of as your base retail price. So this is something that we thought was certainly interesting and could fit into a lot of different situations. So we wanted to give it a look here. So I'm going to start by going in a bit into the technical details. So this is sort of a side shot and a front shot, so you get a sense of the physical footprint. The base of this is about 9 inches across, so 10 inches across, something like that, to give you a rough scope of the device. And as you can see, it's got a lot of different ports on the back, which we'll dig into. But to start, let's talk a bit about the optical side, because I think image is really first and foremost what we look to for a camera. So it does have a 1/3-inch sensor, which is sort of your standard PTZ Optics Huddlecam sensor size. It's in most of their PTZ lineup. And it does 1080 by 1080p 60. So it's definitely a full res, even though it has a small sensor. The zoom on this is the 20x zoom, so sort of fits again in that same sweet spot for PTZ Optics. And it goes from a 4.7 millimeter to a 94 millimeter. So to give you a sense, because I always talk about things typically in sort of the full frame equivalents for these things, the 4.7 millimeter is about like a 20 millimeter, give or take, of a full frame sensor. And the 94 millimeter is about a 500 millimeter full frame sensor zoom. So you get a sense that it's a pretty wide range that this covers using this. And the interesting thing is the pan and tilt. So the pan is basically 170 degrees each direction. So basically that's 340 out of 360 degrees total. So you sort of have a 20-degree blind spot in the back. But other than that, you can cover a pretty wide range. The camera itself that has a tilt goes up to 90, so you can point to the ceiling, but it's limited to 30 degrees pointed down. So where you mount this, you'd have to have enough distance between yourself and the target for this to make sure that 30 degrees would work fine for you. But in practice, that shouldn't really be an issue. So the other piece then is talking a bit about the connections on this, because that was the other part that when we saw this, we were pretty impressed by for this price. So the unit comes with, as we said, a range of connections here, as you see here. But let's go into them. It has SDI, and it's SDI 3G, and it also has HDMI. And based on our testing, the SDI and the HDMI can be used simultaneously. So you could be routing one to do monitors and the other into a production switcher. It also has a USB with a USB webcam connection. So it emulates a webcam to a to a software device. So you look like anything that you would, basically bring into Zoom or anything else. We didn't really get much time to test that, but we are planning to do a show later on, which is going to use the SimplTrack Lite and the USB webcam with live to air and show what the guest experience would be for having, the live to air system pulling in a SimplTrack Lite connection from a remote guest. So that's something we will be covering. The other thing, and this is another thing that caught our attention, this has NDI HX3 in it. So it comes included. It's not like you can get a license for, it comes included. So in that sort of sub $1,500 price point, you have SDI, HDMI, and NDI, as well as a USB connection to a computer. So that was a pretty good mix of capabilities. It has a basically like an 1/8 inch line level audio jack. So it's line level, it's not mic level. So you would need, if you were using this for a mic, you would need to add that in as a some way to, basically boost it to line level. But this will embed that audio over your NDI feed and send that back. As far as I know, I didn't get a chance to test all of this, but I believe it just works over NDI, but we're going to do a little more testing. We'll find that out. But that does give you a way to bring audio from a remote location into your production that way. And it has the full range of sort of the typical controls. It does the Visca RS-232, so that's sort of the classic way to connect to a PTZ. But it also does NDI and Visca over IP. So, pretty standard, both in the RS-232 and in the IP space for control. So, before we go any further, I do have some comments that we have coming in here. So let me get to that. So we have John Simon. So John, good afternoon to you as well. Thank you for joining us here. We have Dave Edwards from Southern California. So Dave, good to see you here. Hopefully it isn't too hot in your neck of the woods. It is pretty hot here. So we have Michael Quist. Michael, thank you for joining us again from Copenhagen. So that's always good to see you here. So we have Joey Otto coming from the UK. So Joe, thank you. So Michael Quist is saying, is a roof mount possible? So that actually, one of the things in this camera, and I did talk to PTZ Optics about this, it is not able to do an inversion. You can't sort of sit there and turn it upside down that way. If you did something like that, you'd have to do that, in software somewhere else. So it's not impossible to do, but unlike the other PTZ cameras, which have the horizontal and vertical inversion, where you can sort of swap the image, this only has the horizontal inversion. And so you don't get the ability to do this through sort of a ceiling mount where you can just do that in camera. But that may change. That may simply be a software firmware upgrade, because it is just playing with bits. So maybe a future version will have that. But as far as I know, right now, that's not possible. And we have, let's see, we have Bert Williams from Trinidad and Tobago. Bert, thank you for joining us here. Great to have you. Oh, and we also have Aldoya. Sorry if I'm not saying your name correctly, Aldoya, coming to us from Bahrain. So hello, good to see you here. Okay, so the next thing then I want to mention is that you can take the SimplTrack Lite and just plug it in and it will do tracking out of the box. If you put it in there as a camera, it automatically turns on with tracking enabled, and you can walk and it will follow you. But to really get the most bang for your buck, the most value out of the camera, you really should download the Huddlecam Control App, which will allow you to configure the camera and do a lot more interesting things with it. So I'm just posting this up here It's on the PTZ Optics site under their applications, and just look for tracking control software. But you can download this, get that on your system, and it will really open up a lot of possibilities. So I'm going to jump now into the actual software so we can look at how this would all be configured and set up. So this is the tracking software that they provide. And a couple of quick things. It will dynamically find cameras. So if I click Start Search, it's actually going out on the network, looking for all of the trackable cameras and displaying them down here. And then all I need to do is I can add that, which will put that as one of the cameras that I want to control for this production. And that's what I've done. So I have this camera sitting up here now, which is the Huddlecam SimplTrack Lite. The first thing you normally do is you want to configure the camera. And there's a pretty robust configuration menu for doing all of this. So it really starts with streaming, like what are the video streams that you want. And it lets you configure two streams. One is what they call the main stream. So this would be the stream that would normally go out over NDI or, be going out SDI, whatever you're using for your main production. It also, though, has what is called a substream. And that's usually a lower quality stream that you'll use for reference or other things. That will typically be the stream that you'll send out like Rtmp if you're using that just as a quick monitor. But we're just going to really focus on the mainstream for this because that's probably what most people are going to be using in setting up this camera. So as I mentioned, it has 1080 resolution, and you can set that, but it also has sort of HD 720. As well as these, they're probably pretty odd resolutions. They're more common in certain types of surveillance and other types of applications. Like D1 is 704 by 480, and quad VGA is just like 320 by 480. So these are 320 by 240. So those are sort of your odd ones. But it gives you the two HDs, which is really what's critical here. It has constant bitrate and variable bitrate for the rate stream that you want. We would recommend constant bitrate unless there's a compelling reason not to. It's just the most compatible. And it defaults to 4K as the stream size, the stream rate. And we think that's great for the quality that you want to get out of this camera. It also, and this we thought was really cool, it gives you H.264 and H.265. So this can do HEVC. If you have a device downstream that can decode HEVC, it's here for you. And that's another nice thing to have inside the configuration for the camera. And it gives you choices of encoding level, from the sort of the baseline, main, and high. So I typically keep it on main. That tends to be broadly compatible and does a good job with managing the bit rate. So we saw that. The other piece, though, in addition to the video, I mentioned that it has an audio in jack. And you can control everything you want to set up for that, including like the sample rates and the bit rates and everything else that you're going to use for this. This is something that's great to have. Normally, I would recommend processing audio on its own chain, but sometimes that can work great where you just need to get audio from a remote location and you have that camera coming over NDI. It can be a lifesaver sometimes. So it's there for you if you need it. The other piece, or the next piece really, is the networking. Again, same type of general stuff you'd have. We just set it up for DHCP, but you can set it up with static IPs and other things. Our recommendation for anything you set up in a studio is use DHCP, and then in your DHCP server, you can look at the MAC addresses of devices and assign them specific IP addresses. And that gives you the most flexibility. So if you go outside and you bring cameras to another location, it'll get an IP address natively that will be compatible with the environment. But in your studio, then you can still have dependable IPs that you'll know for each device. So that kind of be our normal way of recommending how to set this up, but that's all there for control. I mentioned Rtmp, and that's another stream. So in addition to NDI as an IP stream, Rtmp is also available, and you just turn that on and have that go out. Where this works really well is for the SuperJoy. So we've used the SuperJoy, and I'm not shy about saying we're actually real fans of the SuperJoy and the capabilities in that. one of its capabilities is that if I select a camera, it can pull the Rtmp stream of that camera and display that out an HDMI port connected to the SuperJoy controller. And that gives you a way to look at a source and set it before you switch that live. So we think that's a pretty cool capability in the SuperJoy, and this is how you'd leverage that over here. So protocol, this is not something you really need to worry about. It's setting up everything if you were controlling this through some sort of external control, things like Crestron or other things, which would be more common in larger AV settings. So that would be something that you'd set all the things up for doing that. Not something we really worry about. The upgrade, again, just for firmware, I would recommend this, and to everybody. Once you're confident that a firmware upgrade is available and good for you, update your devices typically. It's something that, unless there's a real reason not to, or you're nervous about doing it, it makes sure that the bugs that are typically in earlier releases are resolved for you. So it's definitely a good thing, especially if you run into any issues. That should be your first step. So you may turn around and say, I don't want to touch it. If it's good, it's good. And I appreciate that. But if you run into issues, that would be your first step, is to upgrade. So would recommend that. The camera also lets you lock down all these settings via a password. So another good thing, especially if you're dealing with inexperienced crew where you don't want them by accident to get in and start to change things, as it can happen when people sort of get lost navigating. But that's all in here. It also has the ability to add a timestamp to the video, and it can even use network time protocol, which means you can have a network-based time signal that every one of your cameras picks up. So they all, from a time base, are displaying the identical times with the video. So the last thing in this configuration panel, though, is NDI. And this, I was really excited to see this. First, it lets you pick the group that you want to make this NDI source from this camera available from. So it defaults to public, which means everybody could see it. But if you wanted this camera to be available only to certain groups, certain studios, you can actually set it up with a private group and use Access Manager, NDI Access Manager, to control who gets to see this camera. So that was really nice seeing this in here. And the other thing is, it lets you work with discovery servers. So if you were not using sort of the MDNS discovery across the network, but have a server that everybody's going to go to, this camera can be part of that. So some cool stuff in the configuration, the way it's set up. So the next thing I want to jump into is the actual configuration of the tracking piece of this, because that's probably the unique value that we all want to dive into. But there are a few other people that have contacted us. So let's jump in here. So we have Battle for Freedom. Greetings and salutations to you as well, Battle. Thank you for joining us. So Michael Quist is saying, Huddle, does that mean it could be used for sports also? Or is it just the gimmick name? No, Huddlecam actually comes from a term called a huddle room, which in the AV space is usually an electronic meeting space meant for a small number of people. So Huddlecam sort of got its name off of that, and that's where it comes from. The camera, though, I mean, what we're seeing, and especially, that it has 720 and 1080 and does SDI 3G. So we think, it definitely could have a play in sports. That would be something, that I think it's equally as flexible as a camera that way. I don't think tracking, it would be good for tracking at all on sports. So that's sort of a different type of heuristic that's used to identify where motion is and what's happening on field. So probably wouldn't work for that. So let's see. So Michael's thinking as a gold line cam in football or indoors, like in a basketball game. It is, it is possible. And like I said, as a camera, I think it would be excellent for that. The tracking, we haven't really put it through paces for something that would be equivalent to that. I don't know how well it will respond to fast motion. So things that I know there are sort of auto tracking for things like tennis, where there's motion back and forth. And those require very, very fast responses, almost instantaneous to do ball tracking. So that's something that, we haven't tested. So I don't want to give you an opinion, that's, could be wrong. So I'll just say not tested, but I would think that that isn't the intended design goal of the tracking that's in it. So, and we also have Samuel Norvik join us. Hello from Norway. Samuel, greetings back. Great to have you here. Okay, so let's jump into how you set this camera up to do the tracking. So I'm going to come over here, and so this is going to be done in the tab called the main view. So when I click on the main view, I have this camera here, and I've selected it, and it gives you different ways. You can set up, if you had multiple cameras, I could set this up with, up to 4 cameras that I'm working. Since they're only dealing with one, I set it up to just look at the one. But this gives me a preview of what's coming in off this camera. And there's 2 places that you are going to do control for this. The first is going to be if you want to set up presets. So this is anything where you want to do locked in shots for different things. And we'll come to that in a moment. The other piece, though, deals specifically with the auto tracking. So that's this button down here called Settings. So in Settings, there are 2 tabs that are active for the SimplTrack Lite, and that's the basic 1 and basic 2. There is a SimplTrack 2, which is a higher end camera with different hardware, and that actually uses some of these other tabs, the Senior 1 and Senior 2. But for the SimplTrack, this is Lite, this is just these first 2 tabs. So the basic 1 tab allows you to do something called setting a lower bound for the tracking. Now, if you picture, for most people, what they'll have is if they were on a stage or in front of an audience, what you're going to want to do is you're not going to want to track movements that are taking place in the audience, even if that's part of a broader camera shot that you may have. So what you're telling this camera to do is to say, let's go and set a lower bound. And you see this little green line across here. This is saying ignore any motion that takes place below this line and only use motion above the line to do tracking. So that sort of space now allows you to cut out an audience and can get rid of a lot of misfires. So it's a very nice feature that's in this. And you can just, sort of move it up and down and, just as needed, you'll see the line move. And then when you're done, you're fine. The basic 2 lets you talk more about how the controls react to motion. So it gives you tracking sensitivity. So how quickly when somebody moves do you want to move and follow them? So that's a great way to sort of dial in the sensitivity so the camera isn't jerking all the time, especially if you're tighter shots where you could have more motion in and out of frame. It also says what's the tracking speed. So when somebody moves out of frame, you typically don't want to whip the camera around. I mean, if you think of the way an actual camera operator would normally move a camera, they do very soft ones. So you sort of start slowly, move faster, and slow down in sort of a nice sort of S curve of a motion curve. So that basically is what the track speed lets you do. Set how quickly you want that movement when somebody moves to take place. And the lost timeout basically says, how long does somebody have to be out of frame where it doesn't have anybody it's tracking before it goes back and says, I'm going to start to look at the entire scene and see if I can find this person again. And that lets you do that. The other thing that's nice is that tracking can also take place in the tilt motion. So if I were to stand up, it would be able to track up and track down on me standing in the frame. So it's not just a horizontal track like as somebody would walk across the stage. This is also a vertical track. And that can be very, very useful for a lot of things that you want to do. So with these set up, let me get out of here. And let me talk a bit about how you would normally set up the SimplTrack. So let me go to the preset. So the first thing that they ask you to do is to use preset 0 and preset 1 for two very specific purposes. So for preset 0, what you should do is you should frame the entire width of the set that you want to track, that you're going to be tracking in the coverage of this. And so if I call that up, that's basically the shot I have here. So it goes from sort of one end of the studio over to the other. Then you have preset 1. And what preset 1 is what is the shot? So let me stand up, because this is sort of like a normal thing. If I'm normally framed, what is the shot? So let me call this that I want to have as sort of my baseline shot. So I'm pretty close to the camera, so there's not a lot of headroom. If I was further back, there's more. But these two sets, when you set preset 0 and preset 1, it's telling the system how it actually should sort of frame things when it tracks them, and it gives it the entire space that it wants them to track. So let me sort of sit down, and I'll go, and I'm sort of low in the shot now. So I'm going to go back to the wide shot we have here and call that back up. So now it puts the full frame. So those are the two main initial presets that you want to set up to help guide the tracking on the camera. The second thing, though, and this is another that I think is really a very cool feature, is they have what they call these smart presets. And what they let you do is when somebody walks into the space that preset covers, what it will do is it will automatically take that preset and lock it in. And there's a lot of good use, and we'll demo that in a moment. But the way you set that up is you can have 4 of these areas, 4 of these zones that you set up on your stage that the camera is looking at. And you can then say, so you set preset 84, 85, 86, and 87. You set those up, and then you can turn them on by setting your device to preset 88, and you can turn them off by setting it to preset 89. So a little bit of a clue from a front-end point of view if you're doing this from the control, but this is something you could set up as buttons inside a controller, and that would be very natural. But it gives you a clean way to do that. So since we've gone through all this stuff and sort of as a talk through, let's actually demo this. So the first thing I'm just going to do is, I haven't had tracking on, so I'm just going to say start tracking. So I just click the start button. It takes a minute, does everything, and then it sort of finds me in the set and zooms in. So let's see if I can. I'm going to switch to a full shot of this because I think that would be more interesting here. So what I'm going to do now is just walk around and give you a sense of exactly how this would work. So now, as I get up, the camera moves and adjusts. I'm pushing in my chair, so it's keeping me framed. I'm walking over to the side. You can see it does a decent job. I don't have a fast track, so it's sort of gliding into position. You can see I have a pole in front of me here, and it's still able to do the tracking with something in front of me, which we thought was really smart, because this is only using the image coming in. It's not using a secondary sensor for that. So now if I walk to the other side of the studio over here, I can come over here, and this would be very similar to what somebody would doing. And now if you notice, I hit a preset. So I set up a preset next to this monitor, because this could be a whiteboard. It could be a monitor with slides that I'm going to. But now I have this all set up, and you can see that even if I'm moving or doing anything, it is not shifting the camera at all. It's keeping it locked in to this preset. And so when I walk away from here, it lets me get about 3/4 of the way out of the shot, and then it goes back and starts to discover me in the full area, and then it just continues tracking as normal. So it gives you an easy way. Now, if I walk really fast and do something like it wouldn't, it still catches up. And I just sort of stepped into the zone over here, so it locked it in there. So you get a sense of how this works. One of the cool things, though, is you can have 4 of these zones. So if I set this up, I could have something where when I'm seated in a chair, that could be a zone. So as soon as I cross in front of my chair, it can go and zoom in and give me a nice shot as if I'm a sitting guest. But when I stand up and walk out, it would go and pick me up and sort of track me to a whiteboard or to a monitor. and let me do that. So as I come out of here now, see it pulls in, and then when I come over and sit back down, it goes and reframes me, and that's that tilt tracking where it's coming in and tracking me on the tilt. So one other, to give you just a clearer view of what's going on with this, I have this 2-shot here where we have a camera on the SimplTrack. And so when I stand up, you can actually see it's starting to move and doing everything that you would expect. And you sort of get a sense that it has that momentary hesitation. And now you see when it comes in here, I'm stopped, but it's still locking in to that shot, gets that lock in, and then comes away. So this is the full sort of flow of how the camera works with this. But we wanted to actually show you all of this in sort of a real set where a lot of these things sort of, they work great in theory, but when you put them into practical sets with different types of images, reflective surfaces, and you end up where they don't work as well. And so we wanted to show this to you inside the framework. So let's see here. What else do we have? So we have a few more comments. So let me jump to that first. So we have Jawad from Stockholm. Jawad, thank you. Great to see you here. And we have Michael has a few things. He said it was not smooth going from preset 1 to 0. So and this is something that is probably worth mentioning. Typically in a PTZ scenario, when you pop between different presets, it's just trying to do what it can to get there. And each one will have its own algorithm, but that is typically not something that's meant to happen on camera. I sort of did that here just because I wanted to be able to talk and be framed correctly for that. But, even if you went to higher end cameras and I just punched in different presets, it wouldn't look particularly appealing. It's not a smooth camera move. On the other hand, when I went into the preset zones, you did see that in that move, it finished it off and zoomed into that using a much smoother transition into those preset zones. So, and that's, I mentioned that the zones are a very nice feature. So that, I definitely agree with you there. So in terms of the things that are meant to be on camera, I think it does a very nice job. The way it handles the sort of the off-camera presets, theoretically off-camera, yeah, I mean, it's not designed to be the smoothest. And, higher end cameras can do that and can be programmed to do that almost like sort of pushes and glides and, sort of those types of camera moves that you would expect an operator to do. But again, we looked at this in the context of a $1,500 camera and what it can do. And frankly, we came away pretty impressed. And I think let me just switch one more time over to here and go to the camera feed itself. I think we didn't white balance this because sort of everything is balanced for our normal studio camera. But the color rendering in here is actually really pretty close to what we see live on set. You are not getting, any type of real distortion color-wise. The image itself, softer than our other camera, but with more light and properly balanced. We think, the image quality you get out of this, especially in this price range, is really good. So definitely something to consider. So I think, I always tell everybody, when it comes to things that make it on air, never buy that on somebody's recommendation. Buy that after you've had a chance to look at it. All I'm saying is I think this camera would definitely be, worth a look. All right, so I think that's everything that I wanted to cover here. Now I'm back to our camera. But I think you can see, so the coloring basically is like the pinks and everything you have behind me here and the blues. They're pretty close to what we have for the camera that's already balanced. So that was what I meant when I said I would think the colors are fairly accurate, even if the white balance isn't set for that camera the way we have it here. The other thing that I didn't mention is that you have the ability to go into the menu on this camera and do all the stuff you do in a normal PTZ camera, change, adjust the image and do all the other things. So when we talked about white balance, this would be a way to, we could go in and do all that stuff. We didn't set it up for here, but that capability is there. One of the things that this camera doesn't have that most PTZ optics cameras or the later generation do is built-in SRT. So it has baked in NDI, which is great. It doesn't have the SRT, so that's something, if that's an important thing, that's just something to consider as well. But, overall in the price range, we think it was pretty good for the money. So let me see. So we have Jawad has something that says, Jawad is saying, my set is a small room with a PTZ in the middle, and I'm actually using a 360 around. In this case, how do I frame preset 1? Okay, so the only way to do that, Jawad, would be you have to zoom it out sort of full. So it's like I said, a full frame equivalent of 20 millimeter. So the only real way to get that is to say, what can I visually see within that 20 millimeter space? I am not saying, so the tracking isn't just limited to that space. So if you were to continue to walk around, it would continue to track you. It just, if it's looking for you, if it loses you, like you walk out of the room and come back, it'll only look for you inside that sort of 20, the full wide shot that you give it of your stage. So it will still be able to do the tracking. Just that rediscovery, if you walked out, you'd have to go back to that front where the camera is going to sort of default to look for you. And that would just a way to think of, how you could use it. But it will still track you all around as far as the camera rotation could go, which in this case is 340 degrees. So definitely, it has a pretty wide range for that. So let's see. Michael just said nice camera for the money. Yes. So Michael, we agree with that. So Michael also is asking, can it go to vMix via the vMix remote, the camera? So I'm guessing that's sort of like for vMix call or something. In theory, yes. It does have a USB control. This is something I mentioned that we are looking to do a show on. We'll show it with live to air, and sort of give you an opportunity to sort of see how that would work coming in as a remote source. So we're going to set this up so that you'll have a remote guest come in, and we'll bring them in through live to air, and you'll get to see how that camera tracking looks for a remote production. And that could be really good if you have somebody, especially in a corporate setting, where they may want to move around. They may be sort of sitting here going, hey, I need to give a presentation to other people in my in my meeting, and that would let you do that. So we're gonna do an in-depth dive on that one as well. So thanks for putting that in. So Michael is saying, maybe in the post show, could you compare this camera to, example, a Bird Dog P110? So I can actually, we can do that in the post show. So yes, I don't have a P110, but we have worked with the P100s. So I can sort of give you a rough feel for, what I think of both of those. And, then you can sort of make your decision. I know they're sort of both in the same general price range, but definitely, we'll definitely talk about that post show. So I guess, speaking of post show, great segue here. Why don't we wrap up this main show, and we'll go into the post show hangout, and we can get any more questions answered or dig into anything else anybody wants. But if you can join us, that would be great. If you can't, we'll definitely see you next week. If not, we'll see you in a few. All right, welcome back to the post show. So I want to sort of jump in where Michael had asked the question about comparing this camera to the P100. So from what we saw, because we've looked at both of these, uh, the image quality is roughly equivalent. I wouldn't put one over the other. The sensor size is pretty much, I believe they're both sort of that third of an inch sensor size. So I wouldn't expect any real difference in terms of like low light performance or anything else. We've looked at we've looked at both of these cameras in different scenarios, and so and from a visual sense, I think they're very similar. The P100 has a full NDI, and also includes SRT in the latest firmware. I still don't know if that firmware is actually officially out, because I know this has been something that's been sort of on the verge of being released for a while. So I'm not sure if that's actually out. So it has that, but it also has full bandwidth NDI. And I'll make a point here that may be controversial. For a 1/3 inch sensor camera, I don't think the full bandwidth NDI is going to give you an additional image quality that the HX wouldn't get you. There is slightly lower latency, so if that were a big consideration, it'd definitely be something. But I think the HX, especially like the HX3 and sort of the newer flavors of HX, the latency's difference has been reduced, and the quality has been raised on the HX side of the house. So I think in that sense, they're roughly equivalent. Where BirdDog has done a lot is on the software side. So they have a camera controller that really has very, very detailed, color correction and adjustments. So in that sense, I think the BirdDog P100 line has a lot of depth in terms of those sorts of adjustments into the camera. But I also know that PTZ Optics has some stuff that they announced with their camera controller. So I haven't had enough of a chance to play with that to give you a real comparison for how the color controls, would work, one to the other. So right now, I'd say it really is a toss-up in terms of sort of the bigger ecosystem of things. The SimplTrack Lite, the one advantage that it has is that it doesn't need any external hardware. It doesn't need a computer active. It doesn't need any of this configuration stuff that we went through in the show in order to do the tracking. You could just take it out of the box, put it in front of a stage, and you could track somebody talking. And I think that's valuable for a slice of this audience, that this camera is designed for, where they really are not sort of technical first, they're content first, and the technology is a way to communicate. So that could be an ideal, option for them. But again, I would definitely recommend if you're thinking of one, certainly check out both and see what would work best for you. But they're sort of in that same price frame, and so whichever one works, I think it could be a good choice for you. So okay, so again, I'm getting told we're having issues with Facebook posts coming in through vMix Social. So we're going to have to take a look at this. We thought it was something maybe happened last week. But so John Drinkwater, John, I'm sorry I don't have the comment to post below, but John Drinkwater says hello. He's, sort of a long time member of the Streaming Alchemy community. So thank you for joining us, John. We appreciate it. So let's see. So there are a few things. So Jawad is saying, the advanced setting, to which camera model are they intended for? So the advanced settings, so I mentioned there were other settings inside of the control for this. There are two SimplTracks that are produced. There's a SimplTrack 2, which is a larger camera, and it has certain additional features that the SimplTrack Lite does not have. And it's much more expensive. It has a IR sensor, so it's not using the camera image to track. It's using this IR sensor, which sort of covers the entire stage, and it uses that to track. So slightly different ways you would set that up. One of the things that the SimplTrack 2 has that is pretty powerful is what was in those additional settings. If you remember when I came in here and I went into settings, we had Senior 1 and Senior 2. Those over there allow you to do two things. First, in Senior 1, you can actually, I can't even click on them because it's not even code here, so we don't have to jump in here. But on Senior 1, what that will let you do is block out areas specifically you don't want to have tracked. So say in the entire space, there's a doorway in the back. In this other camera, you can go and say, that doorway, I want you to take and remove that. So you don't do tracking for anybody walking past that doorway or a window or anything like that. And so it lets you set up those types of regions. The Senior 2 takes that a step further. It combines it with sort of the preset locks that we had, where I walked over to the monitor and that was sort of locked in that frame. It allows you to block movement in areas when you specifically move to one of these tracked presets. And that's really useful because you may turn around and say, there are parts of the set that only come into view when the camera is moved into certain positions. So you can turn around and say, when I'm over here and I lock into that shot, make sure you take all of this out. I don't want any motion in there to come in and influence the tracking. Where that actually, one of the things that we saw is if I left the monitors turned off in the set here, when I walked away from one of these presets, so if I had that monitor on the side turned off and I walked away, because there was a reflection of things in that monitor, but it wasn't fully illuminated, the tracking hesitated pulling off of that. And so it wasn't, so it's clearly there was something in the logic that was seeing that reflection and the fact that there wasn't any real image or brightness to it and processing that in a way that made the algorithm hesitate. This would be something where you could actually cut the monitor itself out from the tracking and sort of pull that out. So now it isn't even looking there. So there's nothing in the image to confuse the tracker. So there are real good use cases around this, but by and large, what you're getting out of this covers the 90%. And in most cases, it covers the types of settings that people would be using this type of tracking for. So let's see. So Michael actually said, in terms of the comparison, he said that it sounds like the PTZ would be great for a no-nonsense setup, like sending it to a remote guest. And I would say yes. I mean, this type of setup, I think is really that simplicity where you could just sort of mount it at some location and then it just automatically sort of focuses and frames a guest. And even if they move, you're going to keep them in frame. I think that's excellent. The fact, though, it also has audio in, and that audio in allows you to, you could take a mic, like if you had a lapel mic, and just plug it into the camera, and then take the feed, the remote feed from video and audio direct out of the camera, which we think could be really good as well. So definitely some nice things there for working with sort of simple, as you say, no nonsense setups. So. Yeah, and Michael's also saying everybody has had problems with Facebook for the last couple of weeks. Yeah, so I'm not sure what's going on with Facebook. I know that they've had a lot of internal things going on, from sort of the business side of Facebook. So I don't know whether this is something to deal with, where they're focused and where they're putting resources right now. But for the last couple of weeks, we've had this as a similar problem. Okay, so that's pretty much everything. If there are other questions, definitely happy to go over them. Uh, the I think the biggest takeaways for us is that this is really a nice small footprint camera. Can work in a lot of different settings. Uh, Works out of the box without a computer, but when you actually use the computer with it to configure it and set things up, it can do things like more sophisticated things like that, smart presets which lock into into a frame, that lock into a preset setting when you walk into a frame with that. So we think that's really cool. But like I say, when it comes to what makes it onto your screen, definitely I would advise you try it out yourself. Make sure it gives you the look you want. Every camera has a certain character, a certain color to it, and that's got to match the aesthetic that you want. So you just have to make sure that you can adjust it in a way that sort of fits in with the visual look that your brand has or that your production is going for. So, Michael, thank you. It was a lot of fun doing this show. It's always fun when I get to do something where I get to interact with gear as opposed to just talk about it. And for me, it's a nice change of pace from some of the coding shows that we're doing. But that is something we are still going to be doing going forward. And we're actually looking to, since we've gone to Node.js, we're looking to sort of talk about automation and scripting in the context of sort of multiple production tools. So vMix, things like TriCaster, things like OBS, anything that you may have that's driving that's sort of a part of your production. How can you use automation to drive all those and coordinate actions between that? So I think the second half of our season here, we're going to start to spread this out and focus on a range of things around automation and scripting, as well as shows like this where we get to work with some gear that we see and got excited about. So, all right, everyone, thank you very much for joining. Until next week, take care, be well. See you.